For 6 centuries, a single empire fought war after war. Against kings, against sultans, against republics, crusaders, rebels, and rising European powers. They conquered nations. They lost nations. They redrew borders. They survived crises, and they kept an army constantly moving, from the Balkans to Africa and the deserts of Arabia. And through all of this, they achieved something almost no empire in history ever managed. They did not go bankrupt. Because the Ottoman Empire didn't just fight wars, they figured out how to finance war again and again. Welcome to the truth of money, where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The Ottoman Empire existed from roughly 1299 to 1922. Longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, longer than almost every state we regularly talk about today. But longevity isn't the most interesting part. The real mystery is this: how does an empire that is almost constantly at war not collapse under financial pressure? In the West, empires are often imagined to fall because they lose battles. But battles don't bankrupt states. Budgets do, leaders do, logistics do. The Ottomans learned this very early. Instead of building a traditional system based on heavy taxation and expensive standing armies like European kingdoms, they built something far more efficient, a structure where war largely paid for itself. But before we explain how that system worked, we need to clarify what the Ottomans actually were. Because for many Western audiences, the empire exists mostly as an image. Sultans, domes, janissaries, the visuals are familiar, but the system behind them, built over centuries, is not. So let's slow down and set the stage. The Ottomans began as a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia. At its head was Osman, a leader with a few thousand warriors and an extraordinary talent for being in the right place at the right time. As the Byzantine Empire began to crumble and Mongol power retreated from the region, Osman's domain was perfectly positioned to expand. Those early victories were not just military successes, they were financial gains. Every conquest meant land, resources, crops, taxes, and new populations that could generate revenue. This is the first key to understanding the Ottoman financial system. From the very beginning, war was not an expense, it was a source of income. By the capture of Bursa in 1326 and the crossing into Europe in the 1350s, the Ottomans were no longer a frontier community. They were a rising power controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia. In medieval economics, that was like controlling the arteries of the world. Anyone traveling from Venice to Persia, from Cairo to Budapest, from Baghdad to Istanbul had to pass through Ottoman territory. That mattered. Because war requires 3 things: food, metal, manpower. The Ottomans may not have had more of these than their rivals, but they had something far more important: cash flow. The empire sat at the richest crossroads of the pre-modern world. Silk, spices, carpets, horses, weapons, timber, sugar, copper, everything passed through their lands, and everything that moved was taxed. But even a strong revenue base doesn't fully explain centuries of campaigns stretching from the walls of Vienna to the mountains of Yemen. Many empires in history had income, most still collapsed under military costs. What made the Ottomans different was structure. They transformed the army into a system that largely financed itself. This is where the story shifts, from geography to design, and brings us to one of the most misunderstood innovations in Ottoman history: the timar system. Think about the single biggest expense for any state. Payroll. Modern governments spend enormous sums on military salaries, equipment, and pensions. The Ottomans avoided that burden. They did not pay most soldiers in cash, they paid them in rights. A timar was essentially a tax district. A soldier, usually a cavalryman called a sipahi, was granted the right to collect taxes from a specific area. In return, he equipped himself, maintained his horse, and appeared for campaigns with proper armor and weapons. There was no salary, no regular paycheck. He financed himself. It was one of the most ingenious systems of military finance ever created. State expenses dropped. Soldiers became invested in local stability, because stable villages meant stable income. Peasants lived under predictable authority, and the empire gained an army that could mobilize quickly without draining the treasury. Imagine a modern state paying soldiers not with wages, but with the right to collect taxes from a district. Sounds dangerous, and in many contexts it would be. But in the 14th and 15th centuries it worked remarkably well. It turned the Ottoman cavalry into a tax-powered military machine, and it made Ottoman warfare cheap. At the same time, European kingdoms relied on expensive knights and mercenaries who demanded payment up front. When the money stopped, loyalty stopped. The Ottomans didn't face that problem. Even in peacetime, soldiers' income continued to flow. War didn't strain the system, it activated it. But the Timar system alone was not enough. There was another institution, one Western audiences recognize by name but rarely understand: the Janissaries. To understand the second pillar of Ottoman war finance, we need to shift from tax-funded cavalry to state-controlled infantry. The Janissaries were an elite professional force, feared by enemies, resented by rivals, and trusted by sultans more than their own families. They were disciplined, centrally trained, and loyal only to the state. In the medieval world, they were the closest thing to a standing professional army. What made them financially unique was how they were acquired: through the devşirme system. Boys were taken from Christian villages across the Balkans, converted to Islam, and educated in state institutions. They were trained from childhood and shaped into soldiers who owed everything to the state. The moral dimension of this system is not the focus here. It was coercive and should not be romanticized, but financially it was unprecedented. The state avoided the lifetime cost of raising elite soldiers. The economic burden of childhood was effectively shifted onto conquered populations. The state invested in training and housing, but avoided the most expensive stage of human development. Once in service, Janissaries were paid and housed, but for centuries they were forbidden to marry or engage in commerce. That prevented conflicts of interest and preserved state control. If the Timar system made cavalry self-financing, the Janissaries created a low-cost yet highly effective professional infantry. Together, these systems saved the empire enormous sums over centuries. And the Ottomans didn't stop there. They ensured that each war paid for the next. Each conquest strengthened the financial foundation of the next campaign. European kingdoms often won wars and returned home poorer. The Ottomans often returned richer. This wasn't strategy, it wasn't luck, it was cash flow. Each conquest strengthened the financial foundation of the next campaign. European kingdoms often won wars and returned home poorer. The Ottomans often returned richer. This wasn't strategy, it wasn't luck, it was cash flow. If you wanted to move goods between Europe and Asia, you paid the Ottomans. Silk from China, spices from India, carpets from Persia, everyone passed through their toll gate. By the 1500s, this system made the Ottoman Empire one of the wealthiest states on earth. War was expensive, but trade was far more profitable, and the Ottomans built institutions that funneled that profit directly into the treasury. One of them was state monopolies. Salt, coffee, tobacco, sometimes soap, essential goods, predictable income. At this point, the story starts to sound familiar. State monopolies are the ancestors of today's strategic industries. Oil in Saudi Arabia, gas pipelines in Russia, the Suez Canal in Egypt. Every empire has a revenue anchor. For the Ottomans, these monopolies were the closest thing to a perpetual income machine. They also relied on tribute from vassal states. From Crimea to Wallachia, many regions paid annual sums in exchange for protection or autonomy. It was cheaper than direct rule. But the greatest strength of the Ottoman financial system, and eventually its greatest weakness, was this. For centuries, it delayed borrowing. The empire lived within its means. Land revenues, trade taxes, tribute, plunder, monopolies. No massive debt. No foreign financiers controlling policy. But it couldn't last forever. By the late 1600s and 1700s, the world changed. Europe industrialized. Trade shifted to the oceans. Military technology evolved. Caravan routes lost their importance. The Timar system decayed. Local officials abused power. Central oversight weakened. The Janissaries accumulated wealth and political influence. They resisted reform. They drained the treasury. They became a state within the state. In the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire borrowed heavily from European banks at high interest rates. Debt grew. In 1881, the empire was forced to hand over control of its finances to an international commission dominated by France and Britain. The end of centuries of financial independence. Does this sound familiar? Great powers rise on financial discipline. They survive through smart systems, they ignore warning signs, and they collapse when the economics stop working. Today is no different. The mechanisms didn't disappear, they just changed uniforms. Tax-funded soldiers became government contracts and privatized logistics. Trade tolls became strategic choke points, from the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea. State monopolies became national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. The late borrowing that destroyed the Ottomans echoes in modern debt crises. The logic doesn't change. Empires don't die on the battlefield, they die on the balance sheet. The Ottomans survived 6 centuries because their financial system turned war into revenue. When that system collapsed, the empire followed. And when money stops working, power goes with it. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History still has answers, if you're willing to look.